Before I say anything further, let me apologize because the summary of the paper, the summary as well as the title of the paper that you have in the program does not exactly match the text of my representation here. And my starting point here is the quotation from the book Perceiving Animals. You can read it on the screen. Quoting Erica Fudge opens up a problem which in essence concerns the debate around animals in generally and particularly in literature. Her thinking can also be expressed in the form of a question: is it possible to talk about animals directly? My answer is clear. It's not possible because language cannot talk directly about other things either. In everyday communication, for practical reasons, we continually forget the tropological dimensions of speech. We only become aware of this when we are dealing with specific speaking positions. For instance, when it involves the art of words, where it is possible to observe various ways of representing the world. It is at this point that things inevitably get complicated, since the concept of representation, on the one hand, is closely tied to the tropological dimension of text, especially through metaphor, and on the other hand, metaphor is a textual strategy which can also have an effect in terms of anti-representation. This does not really signify the abolishing of representation, but the abolishing of its limits. Always, when we come across a representation, its prefix, re, implacably places itself between us and all other reality. In other words, everything we understand as not I. It's true that language is first and foremost a means of being understood. That is overcoming the distance between I and others. But at the same time, it is the cause of that distance which can appear as an unbridgeable gap. The situation is further complicated by the fact that this gap opens up also within language and within the subject. Language is therefore in us and at the same time around us. This is the reason why there are constant crises of language and crises of subject, the human subject, who tries in every way to emerge from the cage of language and mind, to enter the area of pre-reflexive states and achieve the open, where the animals already dwell. This is the zone of undecidability that serves as the space for the meeting of the human and the animal, and for both is therefore a limit and a possibility, a challenge and an opportunity. It signifies the establishing of mutual relations in which the animal is not objectified. It does not serve as a mirror of the human. This space, here I am referring, as you probably noticed, to Agamben and his polemics with Heidegger. This space is constantly subjected to persistent attempts at conceptualization, but regularly evades them. Everything indicates that it is not possible to enter it directly, but only via a detour which leads to artistic works, through poetry, for instance. Why poetry? Because the poetic idiom is the linguistic environment into which we can come most easily into contact with the animal as a being of flesh and blood. At first glance, this sounds like the paradox which was most radically formulated by Coetzee, or rather by his heroine, the writer Elizabeth Costello, in his The Lives of Animals. In her lecture, she explains to the university audience why it is necessary to read poetry. I quote, If I do not convince you, that is because my words here lack the power to bring home to you the wholeness, the unabstracted, unintellectual nature of the animal being. That is why I urge you to read the poets who return the living, electric being to language, unquote. Poetry is therefore a thing that enables us to actually sense the living physical presence of animals. We are proceeding, therefore, in the field of poetry, but at the same time that of thinking, which, as the Argentinian poet Roberto Juarez wrote, are the two greatest opponents of death, since they are its most loyal witnesses. This idea is further affirmed by Derrida, who writes in his own way, for thinking concerning the animal, if there is such a thing, derives from poetry. In this regard, we must first face a paradox. How can the poetic idiom, which is most intensively metaphorical, also be the idiom that is closest to the animal? The answer to the question resides in the method of conceptualizing the metaphor. Here, metaphor should not be understood as a deflection from the norm, not as a means of convincing, and not as a substitution, especially not as a substitution. It should be understood in the interactive and consequently as well as in the cognitive sense, as a discursive strategy with the purpose to change the viewpoint from which we grasp the phenomena of this world. And most important, as the strategy that addresses the incommensurability of two entities. This should result in an expansion of our receptive capacities, the spreading and cultivation of sensory perceptions, or spiritualization of the senses, as the phenomenon was coined by the Slovenian poet Jure Detela, who consistently steered away from metaphors, since they supposedly enable an aggressive identification between entities. He was convinced that it is disrespectful for a poet, as he says, to equate himself to plants, animals, streams, and mountains, for beings are not equal amongst each other. It's clear from this that Detela was thinking principally of the metaphor as a substitution. A similar position of rejecting metaphors is taken, as we shall see, by Deleuze and Guattari, who thus introduced a new concept, that is metamorphosis, a kind of anti-representational metaphor, if I may say so. Their theory was developed mainly on the basis of Kafka's literature and was tied to the concept of becoming, particularly becoming animal. But if I return for a moment to Detela, I can only concur that we beings are truly not equal amongst each other. This means that the feelings of another, regardless of whether this is a human or an animal, to a large extent remain a dark continent. We can never feel exactly what another is feeling. Everyone is somehow filled with separateness from another, as was asserted by the American philosopher Stanley Cavell in his introduction to Claim to Reason. Yet everything points to there being a consensus that the continuous questioning of what it is like to be the other is the only ethical stance, especially when the other is an animal. For example, a bat. Here, of course, there is an instant allusion to one of the fundamental texts of animalistics, Thomas Nagel's article, What It Is Like to Be a Bat. This text has been widely cited and heavily criticized, but his realization about consciousness, which is not exclusively in the human domain, turned out to be uncontestable. The question that he posed is still relevant. in my opinion, of course. It can be understood in various ways as a rhetorical question that already implies an answer, or as a real question that anticipates either a positive or negative answer. But there is also a third possibility, that the question be taken out of the context in which it functions as the title of a philosophical treatise and be treated as a lyrical question. The question taken in this way demands a suspension of direct responses, since it does away with the answer suggested and effectively enhanced by the rhetorical question. It thus, in this state of suspense, opens up an unexpected horizon of possible meaning. It is therefore conceivable to conclude that although I do not know what it is like to be a bat, I can imagine it. For this reason, I turn to poetic texts, specifically those that refer to bats in this case. I analyzed several examples of poetry on this topic, but here, due to my time limitation, I present just one text, Bats Ultrasound by the Australian poet Les Murray. You can read it, this is presented on the screen where you can read it easily. My purpose is to show, because it's not long, as you can see, my purpose is to show that in the text, the use of metaphor acts in the form of interactive metaphor, which from a certain viewpoint can be seen also as a metamorphosis, just as the term was defined by Deleuze and Guattari. Similar to Ricoeur, the two philosophers, although in a completely different theoretical context, reject the division into literal and figurative meanings. They see the metamorphosis as an opposition to the metaphor, but they do not equate it with literalness. For, as they assert, I quote, there is no longer proper sense or figurative sense, but only a distribution of states that is part of the range of the world. There is no longer man and animal, since each deterritorializes the other. In a conjunction of flux, in a continuum of reversible intensities, the words themselves are not like animals, but in their own way, they climb about, bark, and roam around, being properly linguistic dogs, insects, or mice, unquote. Even at first glance, you may notice there is no doubt that in the Murray's poem here, bats function as actual living beings. And it is especially interesting since together with mice, rats, pigeons, nutrias, and some others, they belong to a not entirely defined group, because they are neither fully domestic nor fully wild animals. Moreover, the bat is a distinctly Deleuzian animal, understood as a multiplicity, since we know that bats live in large colonies. Murray's poem, Bats Ultrasound, was published in a poetry book with the telling title, Translations from the Natural World. The poem, which describes the life of bats, is focused mainly on their communication. And there is just one explicit sign indicating a human speaker, insect prey at the peak of our hearing. Our hearing is therefore something completely different from their hearing, since in his or her environment, the human orientates much more with vision than with hearing, while bats and many other animals can see through their hearing. This is echolocation. Thus, for instance, the whale in another of Murray's poems, entitled Spermaceti, says, I sound my sight in peer and long tones. We can see that at the beginning, bats ultrasound evokes certain characteristics of bats, which we more or less know. But soon after, in next stanza, where he says few are vampires, there is a shift from the zoological to the semantic field folkloric tradition. But this vampire tradition is immediately rendered ironic when the next verse informs us that none fleets through the mirror. It is well known how closely vampires are associated with mirrors, as well as the fact that in the human imagination, vampires represent a kind of missing link between humans and animals. Here, we are still in relatively familiar territory, but the syntagma at the peak of our hearing already heralds some unknown landscape until the words in the third stanza, through sound coloring and the distinct breaking of grammars, completely transport us in the sense ascribed to the term deterritorialization. In other words, the reader is drawn into an entirely unknown environment of myriad transformations and becomings, which is graphically enhanced by the cursive script. It is therefore possible to say that here we are dealing with an attempt at intersemiotic translation, which, as a transference from one linguistic system to another, is also a kind of metaphorical process that has been interpreted by the literary critic Michael Malay, a native speaker of English. I'm referring to him because the sounds made by bats have been translated by the poet into English phonemes and constructions and put together in a series of different repetitions, such as eerie, eerie, which according to Malay can also be read as eerie, and this could be heard as here you are. It seems, as Malay put it, that the expression evokes their greeting when they fly off into darkness to hunt. In the case of repetition, ra ra, which imitates a kind of scratching, Malay hears the words as ra ro, perhaps a hunting cry, and so on. The poem therefore offers a traditional translation and at the same time withdraws it. It speaks for bats, but offers its own articulation of their communication. We may observe that Malay's analysis and its intensive search for meanings remains at the level of interpretation and thereby linguistic representation, which Mari's poem far exceeds, when its visions and auditory experiences extend in the area beyond humans. This, of course, does not just involve the translation of meanings and guesswork, but incorporates a linguistic process that operates in the direction of self-transformation, when words no longer represent objects, but themselves become objects ready for transformation. Yet, we can also approach this poem from a different side and say that the warning of the third stanza, when the power of human language as a means of understanding fails, traverses from deontic to deontological level. This shift enables the operation of an interactive metaphor in light of which the whole poem needs to be reread, including the fourth merely one-line concluding stanza, Aram ir our Ari Yahweh. Here it would seem at first glance that with the evocation of Yahweh, there is a reterritorialization in the text, in other words, a return to the known framework. But the poem does not do this without leaving an implicit message, since here Yahweh does not appear as the all-seeing God's eye of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but as a mirror. At the same time, this concluding verse leads us in various intertextual directions. For instance, to Shakespeare's Ariel, the spirit of the air, who sings, "On the bat's back I do fly after summer merely." This couplet evokes the enchanted atmosphere of Shakespeare The Tempest and at the same time hints at the impossibility of objectively capturing a beyond text in language. Words and things are therefore no longer alienated domains, but some caution is needed here, since the specifics of their connection has nothing to do with the modernist poetics of the symbol. The connection is determined entirely by concepts or new ways of thinking, perceptions or new ways of looking, and effects or new ways of filtering. Thus, Maru's text brings us face to face with a unique inventiveness of language, a searching for a way out when the metaphor changes into metamorphosis and thereby generates doubts about the actual possibility of representing animals. Through its graphic sonic image, it points to what is beyond human speech and thereby also beyond any dividing line between nature and culture. More than that, it does away with that dividing line. He or she who writes, if he or she writes in such a way that it propels a language to its extremities and even tries to push it beyond its limits, is no longer a writer human, but a writer red, a writer nutria, or a writer bad. In short, when a person writes, he or she is then at his or her most animalistic. And this writing is not and cannot be distinguished from the metaphorical dimensions of language, in spite of the fact that the animal in such a case is never within his or her metaphorical meanings. Thank you.